I've always thought that effective decision making comes from people who are closely connected with the issues in question.
Welcome to the Leadership Initiative, where we explore the art and science of leadership through thought-provoking conversations with experts, thought leaders, and change makers. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting out on your leadership journey, this podcast is designed to provide you with the tools and inspiration you need to lead with purpose and make a meaningful difference.
So today I'm really very delighted to be joined by Dr. Henry Mintzberg. And, I'll start my introduction of Dr. Mintzberg by a couple of questions. What do managers do, and what should managers do? And if you think about the field of management, it's been studied systematically for over 100 years. And those are pretty fundamental questions that I asked, and there's nobody in the history of management research who's more associated with the work of managers, the structure of organizations, the decision-making of managers, the roles of managers than Henry Mintzberg. And he has many domains in which he has contributed to the field of management and thought leadership and the topics we should be studying and the work that organizations and managers do. And he's written more than 20 books. His work has been cited more than 200,000 times by other researchers. And I would think his media mentions probably, I'm sure, must be in the millions. And so he truly is a living legend and has contributed so much to how we think about the entire field of management and the work that managers do. So we're really delighted to be able to talk to you today, Dr. Mintzberg. So welcome.
Hi, Tim. I'm happy to be here.
So, Henry, I'll start with the questions. And so the first question is, how do you see the role of managers in the decision-making process within organizations?
Well, sometimes too much and sometimes too little. Clearly, managers are key to decision making, and the Harvard Business Review used to call itself the journal. I think or the review or whatever it is for decision makers. So they saw managers as decision makers for years. I don't think they have it on there anymore, but so clearly managers make key decisions, but they don't. Sometimes they make too many. We call that micromanaging. Sometimes they make too few. I call that macro managing. You manage by remote control. You sit in your office and shout out numbers that people should reach and let them make their decisions. So it's clearly central. It's a central issue in organizations. And managers have to walk a kind of fine line between when to act and when not to act. This may go along with this, but I once compared physicians with managers, or at least looked at physicians as managers, and described the stark difference in decision making. Because physicians always make a decision. When they meet a patient, they always make a decision. The decision to do nothing is conscious. The problem with management, and therefore physicians who become managers, is you don't even know when or whether you should make a decision. So sometimes you decide to decide, and often you miss it or decide not to decide. But it is a lot more ambiguity in decision making and management than, say, in medicine.
And I take one thing that you're saying, Henry, is that the decision-making role is one central function of managers, but it must be balanced against the other roles. So if they would say, I'm the decider and that's all that I do, they're very likely to be ineffective.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So from your perspective, what do you think distinguishes effective managerial decision-making from less effective approaches?
Connection. Direct sort of connection with the issues at hand. a sort of deep understanding. If it's something to do with customers, then ideally you should have a sense of customers. If you're in retailing, you should be shopping in your stores to have the customer's experience. So I've always thought that effective decision making comes from people who are closely connected with the issues in question. And ineffective decision making comes from people who are disconnected. Not a fan of remote control managing, and barking out decisions that don't work. Government has a particular problem with this because the people who are supposed to make the big decisions are usually very removed. They're politicians. They may have their pulse on people's needs or concerns, but government implements decisions in concrete, in the sense that they legislate and then they put it in legislation, and some poor person in Podunk who has to implement this decision kind of looks at it like, oh, I can't possibly do that. Who did this? Because the guy in Podunk or the woman in Podunk knows kind of what the situation is and whether it'll work. And somebody sitting in Washington or even the state capital may not know at all. There's a lot of problems with education and healthcare as a consequence of that.
Yeah. Well, Henry, I'm going to return to managerial decision making in a minute, but at this point, I want to ask you about the manager as a strategist, and you've written about the importance of emergent versus deliberative strategy. Why do you think we tend to underemphasize emergent strategies?
Well, we tend to oversize everything cerebral and everything rational and everything calculated and so on. I mean, that's how we train people. MBA programs are very, very analytical. Management is where art, craft, and science meet. And there's not much science in the way of analysis, but not much science compared to medicine, which has used a lot of science. It's about craft, which means experience-based, not evidence-based. And so and the art you can't really teach the art. So you end up having to focus on the experience. Now I've talked enough that I forgot your question, Tim.
Why we underemphasize emergent strategies?
Yeah, emergent strategy. Great entrepreneurs are very attuned to what's happening on the ground. They're very connected because they started the business, because they know the business, they see an opportunity and so on. Emergent strategy is playful, it's open, it's flexible. And the great strategies, I think, most often emerge. And that's another way of saying that strategy is a learning process. It's not a planning process. I wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning and called it an oxymoron. It's a learning process. And if people are doing remote control managing, they're not capable of learning because they're not in touch.
Mhm.
And boards will look at managers and say, so what's your plan? Or banks will look at managers and say, what's your plan? And it's not often that somebody can say, I'm still learning. But that's the truth. Gerstner was one of the few at IBM who said to everybody who was bugging him, he said, you're not going to get a vision thing out of me. Or what he meant was yet, because he was still learning.
No. So we've kind of touched on this, but I'd like to talk about data and evidence-based management. There's a lot of attention on that, or has been.
Mhm.
So what role does management play in ensuring that decision makers have access to relevant and timely data? And what role should that play in their decision making?
Well, evidence, as those terms are used, evidence and experience, as those terms are used in medicine, people think of evidence as research-based, and certainly any manager who's worth anything is is going to get all the evidence and all the data and all the facts and studies and analyses they can get. But they also have to recognize that it goes far deeper than that. And you can't just rely on evidence. You can't just rely on data because data is biased, you know. If you have to quantify, then you're stuck with whatever you can quantify, and you can't quantify quality very easily. You can quantify quantity, obviously, by definition. It's hard to quantify quality. It's hard to quantify motivation. It's hard to quantify vision. So a lot of the most important things in management don't lend themselves to quantification. So yes, get the data, but don't let it dominate you and don't let it overwhelm you.
Yeah. Okay. In your work, you've emphasized the importance of involving various stakeholders in decision making. So could you elaborate on how organizations can determine who should be included in the decision making process?
Yes, I mean it's not particularly my I don't take responsibility for a lot of that work. Lots of people have pushed that. Um, but we have to include whoever has a is deeply and personally affected by what the organization does. The shareholders are obviously deeply and personally affected, but so are the customers, and so are the suppliers, and so are the workers, and so is the local community. So it's anybody who is influenced profoundly by the decisions that are made.
Now, if you think about making decisions themselves, and you have articulated how managers need to be kind of grounded and where the action is when they're enacting their role, but when it comes time to undertake decision making, how does a manager decide who should participate in the decision making process?
Well, let me give you a story. I knew a head of a geriatrics department in a Montreal hospital who used to say that his physiotherapist is their best diagnostician. Now, what did he mean, and what did that statement imply? A very interesting statement. He was basically saying that I'm the physician, I'm in charge, but we do things as a team, and whoever is good at it should be involved with the process. And he felt that, as it happened, of his physiotherapist was the best diagnostician they had. So she would have been, I assume it was a she, would have been very deeply involved in those decisions. You won't find a lot of managers saying things like that. Because they think if they sit higher on the chart, they're responsible. But smart managers know to turn to whoever could be helpful.
Great. So if you think, Henry, about how the work of managers has been changed by things like technology and the changing nature of our economy, so forth, over the years, do you think the essential nature of managerial work is like, even though the context or the way in which it's carried out sometimes is different, is it just, do you think it's mostly the same? Or do you think there have been changes that that have altered the nature of like managerial work and decision making based on technology and other changes?
The context and what you make decisions about is constantly changing. Obviously, I mean, just look what goes on in the world today. It's constantly changing. The process by which managers function is, to my mind, fundamental. And 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 it's just basic way, the way you make decisions. My favorite, well, my favorite story about decision making, I say there's three ways to make decisions. You can think first, you can see first, or you can act first. And there's a blog, mintzberg.org/blog, that gets into that. And we assume it's thinking first. You think in order to act. You analyze, get the data, analyze it, develop the alternatives, test them all, choose the best one, and all that. And so I say, well, how did you find your spouse? I mean, that's a pretty important decision. Did you do that? And of course, that would have taken you months if, make a list of all the possible spouses and make list a bunch of criteria and assess them in terms of each of the criteria and so on. Nobody does that. Maybe in India when the families arrange the marriages, but usually not. Um, Usually that decision is made by what I call seeing first. You turn a corner and there she is or there he is, and whammo, that's it. My father called in New York, and it wasn't easy to make phone calls in those days. And he called his mother from New York and said, "Today I met the woman I'm going to marry." Wasn't a lot of analysis there. Um, and doing first, I'll leave to your imagination, but doing first means you try things, see what works, and whatever works, you pursue. So there's different ways to make decisions, and we overemphasize the thinking first. We far more overemphasize the thinking first. And when managers are disconnected and data obsessed, they tend to go with the thinking first. When managers are connected, they see things and that influences what they do. Or if they don't know what to do, they try things. But you don't just try things in the abstract. If you want to diversify, you don't diversify in the abstract. You buy a business and see if you can run it. And if it doesn't, you buy another business or try another business. So now how management has changed, or, in that respect, I think despite my efforts to kind of push it in one direction, I think it's gone in the other direction. Too much remote control, too much distance, too much obsession about data, and so on.
Now, I want to ask you two more questions, Henry. First, about if you think about, Cotter and others made this distinction between leadership and management. And while I have you, I'm just really curious what your thoughts are about. Is that a productive distinction? Is it kind of an irrelevant distinction? Do you see those roles as different? Like, how would you reconcile and would you agree with the people who distinguish leadership and management?
Yeah, it's interesting that you cite Cotter because Cotter followed, as he often does. It was Warren Bennis who came up with that originally, and then it was Zeleznik, Cotter's thesis supervisor, who pushed it, and then Cotter came along. He gets the credit for copying other people very often. But I don't think it's irrelevant. I think it's extremely relevant and extremely dangerous. Nobody wants to be managed by someone who doesn't lead. Nobody wants a manager who doesn't have leadership qualities. Pretty boring. Why should anybody want a leader who has no management qualities? They don't know what's going on. They're not connected. So leadership is just another face of management. Leadership is the motivating and team building and culture building side of managing, but there are other sides of managing, as we've been discussing, like decision making. Originally in my thesis, my first book, I talked about decision roles, informational roles, and I forget what I called the third group, but kind of people roles. And the people roles are more the leadership side. But there's the decision roles and there's the action roles and so on.
The last question I want to ask you is about the field of management in terms of how we make discoveries and the scholarly treatment of it. It has become, I talked to many senior scholars who have dismay over the fact it's gotten very technical. And I think you would say maybe decontextualize in many ways. It's different from how you studied, I think, managers and management, and it's gotten more and more that way. And I'd be interested in your views about it, and particularly what you think we could do about it.
Yeah, I ended up doing the thesis I did, which was observing 5 chief executives for a week each and sort of analyzing and studying their work very carefully, almost by mistake, because the head of what NASA wanted to be studied. And I was at MIT and he approached MIT and I ended up taking the bait. He wasn't available to be studied by the time I did my thesis. but I sort of fell into it and discovered, that you said a century of describing managers. Henri Fayol described management in 1916 as planning, organizing, coordinating, commanding, and controlling. And then I'm sitting in the manager's office, and where's the coordinating and planning? And I didn't see any of that, not per se. I saw them give a gold watch to a retiring employee. What's that? I saw them meeting a union leader or a government official. Is that planning, organizing, coordinating, controlling? So, so I simply went out, looked at what I saw, and described it, um, and uh, and it sort of became known for writing the obvious, putting down the obvious. But nobody had written down the obvious. Everybody walked around saying managers plan, organize, coordinate, and control. And I wrote that they get interrupted a lot. They're action oriented. They encourage interruption. It's an action kind of job. So, and with managers, kind of like, oh yeah, that's me. Um, but one of the guys I studied, somebody read my an article of mine years later and said, John Knowles, who was head of the Mass General Hospital, he said, John, this sounds just like you. But it was just like him because he was one of the five people I studied, um, and probably the most action oriented. So, so yeah, we we need to get out there and just see it the way it is, and then describing the obvious can be very helpful, because otherwise you're fighting against this idea that I should be planning more, and I'm saying, well, maybe you shouldn't be planning more. Maybe you should be kind of visiting the factories more. Walk
And
around.
the power of description and the power of simplicity, because
Yeah,
things sometimes get so elaborate that they can't possibly match a new context. And it's very hard for somebody trying to practice like the findings of management in a practical way because it's so elaborate and decontextualized. And
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. Great, thank you, Tim, and
Well, I've known of your work since I was a doctoral student in the field and even an undergraduate. I was an undergraduate business major. So it's an honor to talk to you. And I know you get a lot of requests. And so I appreciate you making time available for us.
thank you, Tim.
Thanks again for listening. This podcast is presented by the Max M. Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. For more episodes, find us on Apple, Google, or podcast.osu.edu/leadership initiative. See you next time.